Hey everyone, I'm Pastor Mike, and this is Ask Pastor Mike, episode 12. Here's today's question. I'm curious about the day of Sabbath being on Saturday and why we attend church on Sunday. Well, this is a question that many people have because the Jews, God's chosen people, were instructed by the Mosaic Law to worship and honor God on the Sabbath, which was Saturday. That was part of their law, and there were very strict guidelines as to what could and could not be done by the Jews on the Sabbath, and that was the way that the Jews were commanded to worship and honor God. Now, many aspects of the Mosaic Law, which if you're interested and want to know more about that, you can look in the books of Leviticus and Deuteronomy. Those are the books that contain the bulk, the vast majority of the Mosaic Law. They were given by God. All of these laws were given by God to point people to Jesus Christ. If we look at the sacrificial system, if we even look at the system of priests and the high priest, if we look at the feasts and some of the offerings, as was the Sabbath, these were to point to Christ. And the Jews celebrated the Sabbath. Basically, I won't go into all the details of it, but basically they were taught to honor the Sabbath by resting. They weren't to work. They weren't to walk very far. There were very specific things about what they were and weren't to do, even in their homes, in preparing food and doing household chores and things. The underlying reason for this, and there is a passage in Leviticus that talks about this, I believe it's Leviticus 40 off the top of my head, that really details the Sabbath. But the overall principle behind the Sabbath was for the Jews to trust God that by working 6 days a week, they would have what they needed to care for their families without working all 7 days. So the fact that they took the seventh day and didn't work was one way of showing that they trusted God. God said, hey, don't you work on that seventh day. And if they were going to honor the Sabbath, they would say, okay, I trust you, God, that I can work 6 days and still have enough to care for my family. If you read that passage in Leviticus, you'll see that that is explained there. Now, let's bring that over into our day. Well, in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 17, Jesus made this statement. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. So some people say, wow, we're in the New Testament, so none of the Old Testament matters. None of the Old Testament laws matter. And that's a fundamental misunderstanding of the continuity of the Word of God and this statement that Jesus made. He said, I'm not abolishing the law. I'm not saying you take the law and you throw it away, but I'm telling you that the law is about me. So what is the main principle of the Sabbath? It is to trust God and to rest. Jesus came to provide rest for us so that we might rest from striving to please God. Jesus paid the price for my sin so that I could have peace, hope, and rest. And I don't have to meet those stringent demands of the Mosaic Law because Jesus has done that for me. The books of Romans and Hebrews in the New Testament, if you want to spend some time looking at those, spend a great deal of time talking about this, that Jesus fulfilled the law perfectly when we could not, and that serving God is a matter of the heart. It's not a matter of ritualistic obedience. I mean, the Jews had so many of these laws that God had given them, they were just like, bang, 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 bang. We've got to do all of these things. And when Christ came, he said, I've fulfilled all that. What I want you to do is orient your heart toward me. Okay? And the fact is, so I guess all that to say, the question is really, why do we worship on Sunday? Well, in fact, no day is specified for our worship in the New Testament. There's no one day. Now, we typically worship on Sundays, I think for a number of reasons. We read the end of the Gospels that Christ rose from the dead. He came out of the grave on the first day of the week, which is Sunday. In Acts chapter 20, Paul refers to when you gather on the first day of the week. In 1 Corinthians 16, when Paul is talking about tithing, he says on the first day of the week, set aside your tithe. So I think that's probably why we land on Sundays. But let me read you this verse from Colossians chapter 3. It's verse 16 and 17. Therefore, let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink, or with regard to a festival, or a new moon, or a Sabbath. These are a shadow of the things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. So we typically worship on Sunday, but what I think Paul is telling us here is don't judge each other about any of that stuff. If you want to worship God on Saturday, please do. I'm happy that you're worshiping God. If you want to worship God with us on Sunday, please do. We would love to have you join us. By the way, if you feel like worshiping God on a Tuesday, worship God. Don't judge each other about what day we worship and what we don't. There's a lot of churches around here. For those of you that know what's going on here, we have 2 services on Sunday morning, and they're getting a little crowded. So we're starting to have conversations about, oh boy, what do we do? We're going to have to start having a 3rd service so we can fit everybody in. And so, of course, the big question is, well, when do we have that service? And one of the options is Saturday night. And if that's what we decide we need to do and that's what's best for our family, then okay. I have friends that go to a church that's much, much larger than ours, and they have a service on Thursday night because that works for their people. Does it matter? I don't think so. What matters is, do you have rest in the finished work of Christ on the cross? Do you know that Christ died for you and fulfilled the law on your behalf before God? And are you worshiping God as the sovereign of this universe? That's what matters.